We've had a look at the way that Ricardo's law of rent gives us an understanding of the development of land values in a new country. It's a very good way of introducing the operation of Ricardo's law of rent. Obviously, we don't have many new countries getting about these days. However, it does give us this fundamental understanding of the peculiarities of something which is very valuable, but at least starts life without a price. And for that matter, since it started life without a price related to its value, in fact a zero price, then it isn't totally surprising that its price can easily exceed its value on various occasions. And in fact, in recent years, Australia has been leading the world with the unaffordability of its residential property in most capital cities. In fact, most of the property markets in Australia have unaffordable housing. What's this saying? One way or another, it's saying that Australians cannot afford the houses that they live in, which has got something to do with the price perhaps being above their value, if you understand value as having something to do with supply and demand. In this case, demand being the capacity of the purchasers, the buyers of housing or the renters of housing space, to be able to pay for the stuff. Usually there's some kind of a balance between the demand's capacity to pay and the price which is spent on things. For instance, if you give somebody more money, then in general that means that the prices for the things they're likely to buy will increase. We've certainly seen this with the easing in the banking legislation and banking lending rules over recent years. Really, that's a process which has been carrying on for some time. Okay, so we have this important relationship of the rent of land, really capitalising into its value, the value of land, the price of land, being related to its productivity. In residential terms, that's the convenience and whatever of living in it, but then moderated by the effect of the wages line that we saw coming down to level the return, the income, to all of the users of property. Now, in the previous video, we skipped through that, but it's important to just think about this wages line and the yellow section below it. Basically, that is the return to the actual users of real estate, as distinct from the owners of real estate who collect the rent, which is above the line. And you don't have to be in real estate very much to realise that, by and large, the landlords don't have a great deal to do with what the real estate is actually used for, what the occupants actually do with it. Obviously, they're concerned if the occupants are lighting fires inside the property and burning out the floorboards or something. But other than that, the way that the occupant, the tenant, either works hard or doesn't work at all isn't so important to the landlord so long as they collect the rent. So there's this disconnect between the activities of the occupant and the price of using that space, expressed either as rent or capitalised into prices. In this video, I want to take this further, though. I want to look particularly at the way that the relative value of land and the value of the occupation to the users changes with changes in the community, in the market, in the economy, whatever. We're just going to go through a couple of slides now to go through that and add a couple of more ideas into our understanding of Ricardo's law of rent. Let's just go over this diagram. This is a very useful schematic to use to understand the way that real estate works. The important thing, I think, is the existence of this boundary, the boundary line that we mentioned in the first video. Now, Ricardo didn't really consider the boundaries, but they are really an important thing in our real estate markets today. They are either physical boundaries, say the edge of Tasmania, or they can be political boundaries, such as the edge of New South Wales bordering on Queensland or Victoria. What these do is that they stop real estate use from going where it otherwise could if there was the physical or political freedom to be able to do it. The most common boundary that property economists have to be aware of are planning boundaries. If you're living on the edge of town, you might have a piece of land which might be very valuable for industrial or residential development, but because it's zoned as rural, no matter what you do, it will remain as rural land. And so from the point of view of the needs, the demand for industrial or residential land, it's as though that land simply didn't exist. Now, what we saw before was that the wages line quickly falls once you reach a boundary to the point where the users of land, that's both labour and enterprise, and stress the enterprise here because often we're talking about users of land who are actually businesses. And so this is more land taking a share of the productivity of businesses, which after all is the majority of the space in Australia, whether it's be farms, factories, offices, shops and so on. Land simply takes a share of the productivity and leaves the rest for the business owner, the entrepreneur, to pay as wages for their other costs and their own profits. And so land actually operates as a market, as an economic force, not simply in opposition to labour, but especially in opposition to entrepreneurship and the business health of a country. This is one of the reasons why China is so cheap to produce things in at present compared to Australia. The reason is that our land is so expensive that one way or another, by the time that land has an influence on wages, because the employee has to be able to pay their rent or their mortgage, which means they need a high income in order to be able to live, have a house rather than just have a tent somewhere or live under the bridge. Land also affects directly employers and producers, companies who are trying to run factories and so on by having the rental value expressed either as rent or the purchase price of factories, also taking a share of the productive profits. And for all of those reasons, production costs in Australia are quite high. And while we might express them in terms of high wages, by the time we take property out of it, especially considering the cost of Australian residential property, we find that one of the main reasons that Australia is becoming less and less competitive as an industrial producer is because of our almost universally high cost of land. And so there's no limit to how much the wages line will be pushed down once you reach a boundary. Let's look at now what happens when the productivity of land improves. This can be by any one of a number of things that improve our physical production, or even perhaps the subjective enjoyment of occupying space. But here we'll look at productive land. Let's look at some technological innovation. For instance, if we started using, well, we've already started using computers, but let's imagine that we're able to start using some kind of technology that was to add considerably, let's say, to farming productivity or even industrial productivity. What that means is that each one of our grades of land would be more productive. And at least initially you would think, well, let's imagine that I'm a factory owner and I work out a more effective way of being productive. That could be, for instance, either technological, or it could be something like getting together with my employees and we're all deciding that we're going to be more productive by simply working an extra hour a day. Okay? It all leads to an improved overall productivity. Let's look at what happens. Let's not worry about agricultural productivity. We've already dealt with that. We can look at population. That will have the same effect, but also look at technology. One way or another, if we do some enhancement, let's say because we're working harder, working longer, working smarter, using cleverer machines, maybe using computers where we were previously using something that was not computerized or whatever. First effect is that there's an enhancement in the overall productivity. Now that's expressed as the top of the productivity for using each quality of land actually rises. And so the margin here is the pale greeny space here. And that's applied to each level of profit, each level of land. Now you'll notice that the wages line initially, especially if it's the result of people working harder or smarter, goes into the pockets of either the labour resources or the entrepreneurial resources that lead about that improvement in productivity. And often we talk in our public discourse, the way that we talk about, say, wages rises or Australia becoming more competitive, we will talk in terms of productivity increases. So we hear that from our politicians quite a lot. And at least we have this idea that if we work harder, that should put more money into our pockets, and that's exactly what happens in this model. Now, typically, innovations of this sort tend to work individually and with a kind of patchy introduction. One entrepreneur might introduce a new type of machinery, or one group of employees might work out some more productive way of working, or one farmer might discover that putting headlights on his tractor might cause his farm to be more productive. And so he'll certainly enjoy a higher level of productivity, higher level of wages and entrepreneurial profits. However, once everybody does it, and it becomes public knowledge, universal, a secondary effect tends to happen. Because after all, the community was comfortable with the wages line down a bit lower before this enhancement happened. And so little by little, what tends to happen? Rents start to increase because overall the economic vitality of the country has improved. And if prices are going up and incomes are going up, say for entrepreneurial profits and wages, the landlord comes along and he says, well, I should have a share of that too. And so what happens? The wages line is pushed down little by little, not necessarily overnight, not necessarily accurately and precisely across the entire market, but one way or another, those pressures will be there to push the wages line back down. We can see that over the last 30 or 40 years in Australia, where we've had extraordinary increases in productivity. 40 years ago, computerised equipment, computerised communication, fax machines, all of these things were not just rare, they simply didn't exist. Where has the productivity increases gone, which otherwise should have increased the standard of living, the incomes of Australian labour, and the profitability of Australian enterprise? Because today, by and large, we're looking at a 2-income requirement for a household to survive in Australia, whereas let's go back 40 or 50 years, let's say to about 1960 or 1970, the average household in Australia survived on a single income. So in the same time, when Australian productivity has risen quite dramatically, somehow the wages line has actually fallen to the point where now a household needs 2 wages rather than 1 to survive. This is an issue that we're going to be returning to from time to time. What's happened, you see, is our real estate values have gone up. And this explains why Australia has this affordability problem, because we have been so productive, but we've also been particularly aggressive at pushing our net income for the users of property back down lower again, to the point where businesses are going out of business and sending their activities offshore, especially to places like China and other parts of the world. And labour, as I say, is now in a double income situation. So we see that with productivity rises. Let's look at some other forms of development. We've looked at technology and we've talked about that, but let's look about infrastructure. In particular, we're going to look at transport infrastructure. Over the last 40 or 50 years, we have had quite considerable improvements in our transport technology, our transport infrastructure. Now, really, that goes back to probably the middle of the 19th century when we started building railways. But one way or another, railways, these days electric railways. Potentially in Australia we might be starting to look at high-speed railways, freeways, other forms of improved telecommunication, but especially physical communication and physical transport. What do they do? Well, the curious thing is, let's imagine that you're on the outskirts of a major city, say Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne, and there is a motorway built. What's that going to do to the productivity of that city? It's going to mean that basically everywhere that is connected to that motorway is going to be more productive. And the reason for that is that if you're living on the outskirts of town, you can now scoot into the city a lot easier and a lot more productively, a lot more efficiently. And so you're going to be able to give the shops at the inner part of the city more business, and they're going to be able to find easier employment and so on, so they're going to be more productive. Likewise, on the outside, businesses operating on the fringe are now going to have customers who might be working in the city. And so one way or another, the motorway from the outskirts of the city to the CBD finds that productivity and the attractiveness of real estate at both ends of the infrastructure are improved. Now, normally the increase in value coming from transport infrastructure tends to be seen more on the fringes. And the reason for that is that if you have some area, some locality, which let's say at present takes you an hour to drive to the centre of, let's say, Brisbane, and you open up a motorway or an electric train line or what have you, and suddenly it goes from an hour away to being only 20 minutes away, suddenly people are able to shop it by going down the new transport, or they're able to get jobs down there. And what tends to happen is that the real estate that once was only able to be used as paddocks because it was so far away from town that nobody wanted to live there, suddenly becomes a sought after, close to the city, part of potential suburbia or potential industrial development. Let's look at how that goes on our diagram. Let's do some transport. You notice here we're suggesting that transport has increased our productivity even further than the technology infrastructure improved it before, or the harder and smarter working improved it before. But you'll also notice that the gradient here has actually been flattened out because the outer land is now more valuable with respect to the inner land. So there's less of a slope, less of a difference in productivity, because before someone would have to locate in the CBD in order to run, let's say, a major shop or a major office centre. Whereas after the transport infrastructure has been developed, maybe that central office can locate out in the suburbs somewhere, whereas previously it was impractical. Or maybe the suburban shops are able to attract the same kind of clientele that previously was reserved for the centre of the city. One way or another, it's these outer parts of the urban area that tend to benefit more from the transport infrastructure, even though the inner parts also benefit. This means that while there is a benefit overall, it's the outer parts which tend to benefit further. That's good news if you own land out on the outskirts. So if you own a house or a shop or a factory on the edge of town, the edge of Sydney, the edge of Brisbane, when some new piece of transport infrastructure comes in, you'll see that your business and your productivity will increase. So you might live, say, on the central coast up around Gosford or whatever, and be too far away from Sydney if there wasn't a freeway and good train service. But once the good train service comes through and the good roads, suddenly it becomes practical to live there, and that becomes very beneficial for you and your business. And the benefits of that infrastructure, as I say, tend to be found more on the fringes than in the centre. But then what happens? Well, we've all seen it, and especially property people tend to be very hungry for it. Overall, that benefit, which may have originally come to the people that were living out on the edge in terms of their wages, their overall standard of living, maybe the profitability of their businesses, is then absorbed because the land values quickly absorb that benefit And again, the net benefit from living or running your business at either end of the transport infrastructure comes back down to somewhere not very much different to where you started. For those of you who live around the edge of major cities, around the edge of Brisbane, southeast Queensland, maybe parts of New South Wales in the vicinity of Sydney, but now the Sydney really extends between the bottom of Wollongong to the north of Newcastle, we've seen this process happen. And certainly down in Victoria, we see the same thing around Adelaide and especially Perth. We can see this process in action. Now, what we've shown here is the way that land values actually happen over time, how they grow over time, and what their effect is on the community in general. This is very, very important because while this process tends to happen over a period of time, doesn't always happen with absolute precision. You can't go down the street and draw a chalk line on the ground and say, well, here is grade 1, here is grade 2 or something. But you certainly can see it happening over time in the background, in amongst the noise which comes from real estate cycles and the argy-bargy of individual negotiations and so on. But in the longer term, you tend to see this Ricardo's law of rent is extremely influential in really determining the way that land values go. If you understand it well, and really we've only scratched the surface with this couple of videos, couple of presentations, you can really understand where the community and its relationship with real estate and where the real estate opportunities are going. And you can also get a bit of an insight into the way that land figures in the larger economy and the operations of society. So this is an extremely important topic, and we'll be coming back to it in other courses.